Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is how to, C# winForms app allow users to log in, which we've already talked about in another video that I'm going to link here for just a few seconds. It's a really good introduction to building this app from scratch and setting up a way for users to authenticate before they can actually start using the app and make sure only certain people can use it. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be adding a way for users to log into this app and create other users, give other people access to this app. So to show you what I'm talking about, we'll start first with the database that I created in the other video. It is called testDB, and the table I created is called users. And if we do a quick select on it, it's a pretty standard user table. It's got first name, last name, email address, and the salted and hashed passwords. And the way my users log in, of course, is with an email and password combo. So if you want to give people the ability to grant other people access to use this app, you might build a form for adding users. Instead of having to give them SQL Server access directly, you could let it all be handled through the front end. So I'll get started with writing the code for this in the SQL backend. And there's a few different ways you might go about this. My favorite one would be a stored procedure. So in SQL, we're going to create a procedure for adding a user. Okay, add user. I'm using the USP prefix, user stored procedures, kind of what that stands for. Just a nice way to organize your procedures by name and group them together by maybe the kind of function, by what calls them, and so on. And this procedure is going to need to declare certain inputs. So let's look at that user table again. And when you're creating a user, the inputs are probably just going to be pretty simple. We'll give them a first name, last name, email, and password. The rest of the stuff will be handled automatically. The user ID is going to auto-increment 345. The password should automatically be salted and hashed by the procedure after they put this info in. And finally, the created on field, I believe, is set to auto-populate as the current server time upon insert, so we don't got to worry about that. So the inputs here, let's go ahead and do at first name. Usually 50 characters should handle most people's names. Last name as well. Password, maybe go up to 100 if they want to give a really long password, that's fine by me. And their email address. In fact, I might put email right after their last name. There we go. Okay, so that looks like all the inputs I'm going to need from whoever's running this procedure. And then as begin end, that's sort of the format that this needs to take. And while we're at it, because when you're writing a stored procedure like this, you might want to do some error handling. You might want some conditions for if they enter certain information that we don't want to go into the database, maybe the procedure should intentionally sort of throw us an error and bomb out. So a good way to kind of handle that is something called a try-catch block. And what a try-catch block does is it's going to try running some code in this section, and if any of that code fails, if any errors are thrown in the try block, come here and run some other code. So what's cool about a try-catch block is you can put multiple statements in here. You can have it do something like, I'll just keep it simple and do some select statements. So select hello, right? I can run a statement like that, which will run perfectly fine. But then if a little bit later on in the try block it attempts to do something that errors out for whatever reason, say for example, if I want to do some addition, 5 plus 1 is 6, but then I do some more addition, select 5 divided by 0, well obviously dividing by 0 isn't going to work, so it's going to fail during the try block and move over to the catch block. And for an example, something went wrong in the try block. So if I just highlight the try-catch block and say try these 3 statements and then here's the catch, and I run it, my statement fails at the divide by 0 and it goes to the catch block and it says something went wrong. And what's cool about the catch block is it can throw things. So I could add to my message here. So what this will do is say, it'll throw, when it goes to the catch block, some message that I type out, and then SQL has a built-in error underscore message, which it will then pass to the string. So let's try that again with my new error message. Right. So now at the bottom it says something went wrong, and specifically it's telling me a divide by 0 error was encountered. You can really get crazy with it if you want to add more error information for troubleshooting reasons. So we can add to this, add a little period at the end of the error message and say error line. And you can even tell it to throw an error line saying this is which line of code that it bombed out on. Might be helpful, by the way, to see the line numbers so we can troubleshoot this better. So in SQL Studio, if we don't already have error lines enabled, I want to say it's in Tools Options. And in SQL Studio 18, you can search through the settings, which makes things a lot faster. And there we go. So we'll enable line numbers, and I like to turn on word wrap too, just for fun. And so now we actually see these line numbers to the left here, which will make it a little easier to figure out exactly where certain things go wrong. The other thing I have to pay attention to is error line is actually an integer value, which the thing about SQL Server is it doesn't like you to combine different types of data. So what we've got here is string or varchar data combined with numeric data, and it's going to freak out about that when I try to run this try catch block. Yeah, so it doesn't like the number conversion. So what you got to be careful with here is instead of just throwing the error line, we'll say cast error line as varchar 1000 or however long you think it needs to be. And when we run that again, now we get a nice descriptive error message here telling us a divide by 0 error was encountered on line 9, which, if we look at line 9, the problem here, of course, is it's actually line 20. It would be line 9 of the highlighted code. So the error line you got to kind of take with a grain of salt sometimes, but it's at least helpful for getting you into the neighborhood of where the problem happened. So with that little crash course on writing good try-catch error handling blocks out of the way, we can clean this up and start writing a procedure that will add a user to the database when it is run. So when you're kind of working your way through it, just think about what it needs to do, right? It's going to take this information that I'm supplying and attempt to insert it into the database. So we can start with that. Begin try, insert the user. Insert into dbo.users, and the 4 things we're inserting, of course, our first name, last name, email, password, values, and a simple version of it would be this, right? At first name, at last, at password. That would be the most simple way to attempt to do this. There's a bit more complexity to the users table that we're going to have to factor in, though. For example, we know from the way the users table looks that the password isn't actually the password, right? But it's rather a salted and hashed version of it, so we're going to have to take care of that. The other thing we need to know is that email needs to be unique. I believe there's a constraint on the table which will actually prevent us from even doing this insert if we have a duplicate email address. But generally speaking, you want to try to catch and handle those errors so that you can throw a more kind of friendly, descriptive error message instead of the system message, which is often a little hard to read for the average person. So instead of just directly inserting, we might take advantage of this begin try and begin catch block to catch things that are not good about the insert and bomb the whole thing out on purpose with the intention of giving a good error message. So what we'll do is we'll actually make a transaction. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Begin tran, and I'll explain what's going on here. Okay, so what's cool about the begin try and catch block is you can actually use the begin tran commit rollback logic with it as well, which basically tells SQL Server begin a transaction, and then process through everything in the try block. If everything in the try block works, then at the end of the try block we're going to commit, meaning we're going to commit the change to the server and the insert is going to go through. However, if anything goes wrong, we are going to maybe throw an error message, and then at the end of the catch block it's going to roll the transaction back. So it's a really good way of making sure, for example, if you're writing a procedure that might insert into 2 or 3 different tables, you want to avoid partial inserts, right, where maybe it inserts 2 out of the 3 and then errors. You don't want that problem. So it'll roll the entire transaction back if any error is encountered. So that's a really good way to make sure nothing works unless everything works. So with that in mind, we can start manually throwing some error handling into this stored procedure. So I usually make a little error handling section in my procedure, and everything in between these 2 tags is where I'm going to check for certain things. So email is a big one, right? We just said we need to make sure email is unique, so that'll be the first error that I check for. We're going to confirm unique emails. So what we can do is say if exists from dbo.users. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing an if block to say if exists, select email from the users table where the email equals their email address. So if it exists just means if anything comes back, right? If I look at the users table and somebody with that email address already exists, it's going to enter here, and I can throw an error, which is going to put it in the catch block. So the way a throw works is, and then there's error code, error message, severity. Those are the 3 components of a throw statement. So the first thing has to be an error code. It's just a 5-digit number, usually indicating what kind of error it is. When in doubt, the kind of generic error code is just 51001. And next is the error message. Email already exists, right? This is a more friendly email or error that we'll throw when people try to insert an email address that's already in the system. And then next is the severity. So severity is just a severity level. Higher severity levels like 16 will log the error into the database somewhere. I'm not really interested in that right now. I'm saying this is a low enough severity error that we're simply going to display the error to the user and then end the procedure. So we'll see what that looks like when we're done building this and we actually start running it. But that's a good way to start doing some of your own error handling, because it's going to stop here. It's going to throw the error and immediately move down to the catch block and stop processing anything else in the try. All right. There's some other things we might want to handle for if we look at the users table again. So maybe one thing we want to make sure is that they're actually supplying us with valid email addresses, right? And it's a little tricky because, you know, without getting too crazy and saying we're going to like send an email verification out that they have to answer, instead we could just look at the basics, right? Any valid email address is going to have probably an @ and a dot in it. Anything that doesn't have that is almost 100% not a good email address. So after confirming a unique email, we'll say confirm valid email. And confirming that an email has certain characters in it, there's kind of an interesting way to do that in SQL. So, for example, if I use a demo email here, like, Andrew@AOL.com, and what I can do is I can tell SQL to tell me where is the @ sign in this email address. So I can do something called char index. And when you start typing that, you can see it kind of autofills here with what are the 3 arguments you have to supply to char index. First is the search expression, and that's what you're looking for. So we'll look for the @ sign. Second is the expression we're searching, which in this case is going to be that email address I just typed in. And then third is going to be the starting position. Sort of lost my autofill there, but it's saying start from where. And you can start from 1, you can start from 0. Not a huge deal, we'll start from 1. And what that's telling me is it's saying the @ symbol is the 7th character in this string, which if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? And that's good. That's something we can use to make sure it exists, because if I take the @ out and run that again, the char index is 0, meaning it didn't find it, doesn't exist. So we can use that to our advantage. So we can do an if statement, select char index at, and instead of the hard-coded email address here, I'll just use the email variable and say if this is less than 1. Basically what this is saying here is if the index of the @ sign is less than 1, then there's clearly no @ sign in the string, and it's not a valid email. And we use the same format as above. And of course we can double check that just to say, put our hard-coded email back in and see if we get anything back. Nothing. If we remove the @ sign and run it again, invalid email. And we can do one more check, right? We said that it has to have an @ but it also has to have a period. So maybe what I'll do here is this. So I'm going to say if there's no @ sign or there's no period, I'm pretty much going to steal this same block of code and just replace the @ with the period. I think I've got the parentheses lined up here, and there's no period. Okay, so if I got this right, I feel like I'm missing a parenthesis somewhere. We'll find out. Let's declare the, all right. So for testing, maybe we'll right. So it's a valid email address, so nothing happens. But if I remove the @ sign, I get an invalid email error. If I put the @ sign back in and remove the period, I get an invalid email. So that to me says we're pretty successfully validating at least that the format of the email input is correct. So that's a good thing to handle for. And of course, normally in the real world, you'd probably add a lot of other error handling for things like making sure the password is a certain minimum length, that it meets a certain minimum complexity requirement. All of that can be done through the SQL backend. But I think for now we'll just keep it pretty simple and say, you know, we're doing some basic validation to make sure no wacky emails are getting put in. So that gives you the idea of how some of the built-in error handling of a stored procedure will work. So we'll skip the part where we would normally also validate like the minimum character lengths for the first and last name, and we'll just move directly on to the part where we say, okay, the error handling was successful. We're going to go ahead and insert the value here. So again, just taking one more look at the users table, we need to make sure that we are inserting the password in the correct format, right? This is a binary input with a salted and hashed password. So I talked about this in the last video, so I'm going to kind of gloss over the way it works here. Be sure to check that video out if you're not sure how it works. But the first thing we do when we're going to insert a user is we need to generate a random unique salt for them. So declare salt. It's a unique identifier. We're going to set it to new ID. Select it just for fun to make sure it looks good. Yep, there it is. That's exactly what we want because that's what we're going to be entering into the salt column here to salt into the password hash. Okay. And now when we come here, clean this up so it's a little easier to read later on. When we insert this information, we do have to remember, this is what I almost forgot in the last video too, we do need to store that salt. So right after the password, we'll add the salt. And the salt just has to get written into the database as well. All right, and then the last thing we got to double check is the way we're doing the password. So also covered in the last video, also going to gloss over it a bit here. We know that the password doesn't get stored directly. It gets stored as a hash bytes using the SHA-2 512 algorithm. And we're going to throw the salt in as well that we just generated. And we also know that because salt is a unique identifier and password is a string, we actually have to convert salt. There we go. Something isn't right about that. requires two arguments. SHA-2. Am I missing a parenthesis? Yes, I am. Yep, always a parenthesis. So, what that's going to do is store the hashed version when I run this stored procedure. That should be everything. So that's a nice way to proceduralize this. What's cool is I can come in here and modify the procedure later with minimal or even no change to the front-end app. And that's what it's going to try to do, right? That's the bulk of the try block, is it's going to do some error checking, and then it's going to go ahead and try to insert the user. And usually what I do, if I know I'm writing this procedure for a front-end app, is I'll make it return some value so I know whether the user succeeded or not. Maybe one thing we could do is we know that when we create the user, it's going to be generating a user ID, and so the presence of that new user ID would be a good indicator that this succeeded. And a good way to do that in SQL Server is right after you insert into a table, if you select scope identity, that's going to select the most recent identity column value for whatever table you were just working with. So scope identity as new user ID, and 1 as success. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm telling it, as soon as the procedure is successful, return so that the front-end app can see it, the new user ID and a 1 value labeled success. And that's important to remember in the catch block. If something goes wrong, I am going to still need to return 2 columns. They can just be something else. So, begin catch. If anything goes wrong for whatever reason, for example, if one of these 2 errors I've programmed in get thrown, we need to return the results there. So, if anything goes wrong, so the new user ID isn't going to exist, so we're just going to select -1, 0 as success, and I suppose we have to actually throw the error message too, so what we'll do there is say as result. We better add that to the successful insert as well. Successfully added new user as result. You want to make sure whether it succeeds or fails, it's at least returning an equal number of columns. The front-end app isn't going to like if it sometimes gets 2 columns, sometimes gets 3, so it needs to at least be symmetrical whether it succeeds or fails. So we're going to get 3 columns, right? We're going to get the new user ID, either a -1 or whatever the identity is, a 1 or a 0 for success, and a result. It'll either say successful or it'll throw the error message and then either commit or roll back. So if I did this right, we can create the procedure. Alright, and now if I open a new window and Control-Shift-R to refresh IntelliSense, that's always important because IntelliSense is the tool which sort of autofills things as I'm typing. And the reason is now as I start typing add user, it autofills for me. And the procedure, as we wrote it, is expecting 4 input parameters. So remember from my last video, highlight the procedure name and press Alt plus F1 to see info about it. Right, and when I do that, the Alt F1 combo is how I know that these are the 4 required input parameters. And I can just enter some random stuff here. So we'll say Luann platter, and add my commas here. Platter at arlen.com, and her password will be same password we've always been using. So let's try running this procedure to insert this user into the database. Alright, and we see the results of the successful insert, right? The new user ID was 1003. That's the user ID assigned to this new user. Success is 1, and the result is successful. So let's try something that's going to fail, right? Like we know we're validating unique email addresses, so if I try adding Luann to Platter with the same email address, that should fail because of a duplicate email. Yep. And so we get the expected results, right? New user ID is -1, success is 0, and the error is the error I handled for, which says email already exists. That's a lot more friendly of an error than the one SQL will throw by default, which is like a violation of unique constraint, right? People don't really understand that if they're not big database heads, whereas this is a pretty easy to understand problem. So the stored procedure has been created. Now let's go ahead and switch to the front end again and start building a form where users can do this using an interface instead of having to write out SQL commands and have access directly to the database in this way. So we'll be using the same form that I used, the same app that I used in my last video, and what I might do is first just taking a quick look through how that works, right? This is an app we wrote in the last video where they type in certain credentials, and if those credentials are invalid, then they get an error. However, if they're successful, they get a login successful. So what I might do is change the behavior of a successful login to instead open a new form that's going to allow me to create users. And in fact, this will give us an opportunity to talk about some pretty cool stuff about the way having multiple forms in an app works. So back in Visual Studio, if I'm looking at my form in designer mode, I can modify what this event handler for logging in does by double-clicking the login button. And that just takes me down here to the point in the code where this exists. And down here is where we see where we left off last time, which is all it's doing right now is just showing a message, whether it succeeds or fails. So maybe what I want to do instead of showing a login successful box would be to open a new form to add a user. And before we start actually writing the code for that, we better create the said form so that we can see how that looks. So if I expand Solution Explorer here on the right, you see Form 1 already exists here. And if we click the name of this app, which is Login App, you can right-click on that, and we're going to add a new form by selecting Add and then New Item. In the window that comes up, it should be third down here in the list, although if you don't find it, you can just search, and a Windows Forms form will come up. Come down here to the bottom, give it a slightly more descriptive name than just Form 1, Form 2. We'll maybe call it Add User Form.cs. Okay. And it just starts a whole new form, exact same type of form as last time. And we'll clean it up just a little bit. We won't go all in on it yet. We just want to get it working and make sure that the event handler to open this form is working before we go too far. So with the form highlighted, I'll expand Properties and maybe just set some very basic stuff, like see how at the top it just names the title of the form is just the name of the form. Maybe we go to the text property here and say add new user, and that just looks a little bit nicer. All right. So we'll stop here before we even add this is a form where they would maybe have text boxes to type in the name, password, email. Before we really get into that, let's go back to the code of Form 1, because we need to just add the code here that says to open this form upon successful login. So the way we'll do that is we'll declare a new add user form. So we'll just start typing it, add user form, and then we have to give it a name. I usually keep it simple and say AF, or like add form equals add, right? So what this is, right, it's a new object of type add user form. The name is AF, and it's going to equal a new instance of this form. Now, what's cool about the parentheses here is if we go back to the code of the add user form, we highlight it and hit F7 on our keyboard. That takes us into the code here. The parentheses here where it says public add user form, these parentheses link up with these, because I can type things in here and say int user ID. And when I go back to Form 1, you'll notice that the add user form changes. It gets the red squiggly line on there because it's saying, all right, well, we were expecting an argument for the user ID, which you have not provided. So I can type 1, and that would just function as the value that this form requires. Probably more to come on that in another video. I'm probably not going to really get into why we do that quite yet. But just know that that's sort of the relationship with the way the forms work. We're just creating it and showing it. Now, one thing I'd like to get in on early with this, so just recapping this before we kind of do a demo run of it, right? When we click the login button, it's going to do the login procedure to make sure we typed in the correct credentials, and if it's a failure, it's going to throw an error. However, if it succeeds, we see here it's going to create a new add user form and then show it. And if we test that out real quick, I've just got a button here called autofill that when I click it, it puts in Hank Hill's credentials, so I don't got to type it every time. And I click it, and there it is. The add new user form shows up. There's a bit of a problem we want to head off right away, which is that if I go back to this form and click login over and over again, it starts opening many, many instances of the form, which is a problem you want to head off early on. And if I remember how to do this off the top of my head, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if any instances of this form are already open, and if they are, we're going to bring them to the front rather than open a new one. So let me try to remember this code off the top of my head. I think that's it. I'll explain this if I have it right. I'm seeing the squigglies already. Dot count? Surely it's not parentheses around the count. Oh, it is. Okay. So what I've done here is an if-else block where we say if application.openforms.oftype add user form dot count is equal to 1, then what that means is one add user form is already open. Otherwise, none are open, right? And we're going to kind of move our block of code into the else block because what it's saying here, right, is if there's at least one of these forms, then we need to perform a bring to front operation. So let me try to remember how this goes too now. Nope, back to application. Yep, there it is. So what this is saying is if there is, and we can even, just in case they somehow have more than one of that form open, then just bring the first one to the front, right? Application open forms of type add user form dot first dot bring to front. So it's going to find the first open instance of my add user form, and it's simply going to bring it to the front of the screen. Otherwise, it's going to open a new one. So let's try that out and see how that works. Right, autofill credentials, log in. There's my add new user form. Now let's see what happens when I try clicking login again. So rather than opening a new form now, what it's doing is bringing the existing one to the front of the screen. So it's little UI quality of life improvements like that that make your app a little more usable, preventing people from opening 300 instances of the same form, forgetting they have one hidden behind another window, right? It's simply going to bring it to the front. Good. Okay, so now we're in a good place to start actually building out this add user form to interact with the stored procedure for creating users. So in my toolbar here, let's go to add user form design mode. And let's start adding some text boxes where they can type in each of these 4 inputs. So if I expand toolbox on the left, filter down for the word text and find text box, drag and drop it in. All right. I like to expand these just a little bit. We know that first and last name and all of that is about 50 characters, so give them room to type that all out. And just like in the last video, you want to make sure you're naming these text boxes so that it's easier to call them by name later instead of having to remember, which one was text box 2. So that's first name text box. We'll just copy and paste it for last name text box. find our email text box. Nope. And finally, the password text box. Okay. Same as with the last video we made, we're probably going to want to label all of these. And I'll go ahead and skip the part where I name the labels. Normally, again, it's always a very good idea to name your labels as well, just in case you need to modify those later. But for now, we know how to name our objects, so we'll just go ahead and give the text the appropriate labels here. Alright, so we're going to have first name, we're going to have last name, and we're going to have an email address, and we're going to have a password. Alright, so let's go through and fix the names there. Last name. Pin this for a second. And password. Right. And maybe realign those to all be right up against the text boxes. Good enough. Okay. So those are going to be my inputs, and probably the last thing they'll need is a button they can click once it's all been entered. So we'll drag in a new button. And you can call it whatever you want, but we'll say add user button will be the text. Oh, sorry, that's going to be the name. The text is going to be add. And then the name down here, instead of button 1, add user button. There we go. We center that just a little bit. So the idea there, right, is now they have a form that they can enter this information, and when they click the add button, it's going to run the stored procedure. So let's add the event handler. Remember from the last video, what we do is we just double click the add button, and that takes us into the event handler that it creates automatically here. I think I created this one on accident a little earlier. And this is where we need to run the stored procedure, get some results back, and display that to the screen, whether it was a successful or failure attempt to add a user to the database. So, take a quick look. We know that the name of the procedure here is USP add user, so that's going to be important. Put that in quotations, or in quotes here. And then we know that we need to add a SQL Server connection so that we can connect to the database and run it. So borrowing from my first video, we know that we created a SQL connection called constring in the program file, right? So if we go to the Solution Explorer and look at program.cs, you may remember we built this static public string. And here we're starting to see the big advantage of doing it this way, which is I don't have to write the connection string out all over again. I can pretty much just steal this line of code from my first form and add it right below the public partial class in this form to say, well, we're pulling that same connection string again for this new form. Once again, it just asks you if you want to load the code library for the SQL client. So go ahead and click the light bulb and select using system.data.sql client. And that pulls it in. So now that we have the SQL connection string pulled in, we can start running SQL commands. Right, and so what I've just done here is declare the stored procedure as a SQL command using the connection string. Right, so the two arguments you have to give it when you're declaring a new SQL command are what is the name of the command or the text, right? Because as we talked about yesterday, you can always say like, let's start from users, that's also valid. Or in this case, because it's a stored procedure, you just give it the name. And then the second argument is what is the connection string we're going to link to this command, which, as we know here, is linked to the program file, which is linked to the actual data source here, right? My localhost database, it's going to run everything as the service account login using the password that I provided. Okay. And once again, because it's a stored procedure, just like what we did in the last video, we need to make sure that we tell C# that the command type is a stored procedure. Alright, now we have to add the parameters. And this one's a little more complicated than the one we created last time because it has 4 arguments that it needs. So I'm going to show you something, save us a couple keystrokes here. Oh boy, I'll do this in Notepad first. You can hold the Alt key and kind of drag your cursor down on these 4 lines and start typing something and have it repeat for all 4 columns. It's a good way so you don't have to type the exact same command 4 times quite the same way. So cmd.parameters.add with value, and that'll save us just a little bit of time here when we start actually linking these commands. Add with value, and so that's what each of the parameters is going to get linked as. So we're doing cmd.parameters.add with value, and we're adding the first name parameter, and we're pulling first name text box dot text. So whatever they have typed into the text box is going to get passed as the first name parameter. So we just repeat it for the next 3. Last name text box dot text. See why naming your objects makes your life a lot easier. I don't have to remember which text box generic name corresponds to what input, right? Alright, now we've added all 4 of the parameters here. Next, we're going to have to tell it to run the procedure. So what we're going to do is open the SQL connection. Remember, like we talked about in the last video, it's always a good idea to close your connection immediately when you don't need it to be open anymore so that you don't leave connections hanging. Okay. Now, we want to pay attention to how we run the procedure. If you remember in the last video, we ran our login procedure. I believe the parameters were right. And that procedure simply returns a 1 or a 0, right? If I mangle up my password real quick, we called that a scalar result because no matter what happens, it's always returning 1 and only 1 value. The problem with the new procedure we wrote is it returns many values, right? I think we still have an invalid email address error here, but it returns 3 columns. And that's going to be important to know because we no longer expect a scalar result. We expect 3 things to come back, which we need to read all of them. We need to know the user ID, we need to know whether it succeeded or not, and we're going to want to grab the result. So a good way to have C# run a SQL command and read a set of values like that is something called a reader. And we do that by calling a SQL data reader and giving it a name. We'll call it DR for data reader. And that's going to be command.execute reader. And that's telling it to run this procedure as a data reader. And what's cool there is we actually enter sort of a loop. We're saying while it's reading through it, we can take some action. I'll explain. I believe that's how that works. Yes. So first we kick it off as a reader, and then we say while the reader is reading through the command, we can perform some actions in here. And what we can do is we know that we're expecting the procedure to return 3 values. We can declare 3 variables in the app and store the results of each of these things into the variables. So that way, even after the command is done running, after the connection closes, we can start evaluating those results. So, what are my 3 results here? New user ID, success, and result. Int new user ID, int success, and string result. Because we know that success is always a 0 or a 1, new user ID is always some whole number, positive or negative, doesn't really matter, and result is a string output like this, some sort of message. So we can populate them as we declare them. So int new user ID equals, and I'll kind of type it and then I'll explain what this is doing here. And we have to be careful because we're converting that to an integer. There we go. So this first value that we've, this variable that we populated, right, it's an integer called new user ID. And what we're doing is we're forcibly converting whatever we get here to an int32. And what it is we're saying data reader, and then in brackets the name of the column we're looking at. Because remember, the columns all have names here, right? New user ID, success, and result. So the new user ID column, it's going to read that, convert it to an integer, and then store it in the new user ID. Easy. So let's do the same thing for success. It's also an integer, so convert to int32, success. And then string result. Converting to a string is slightly different than converting to an int32. So we are saying, right, so for some reason with C#, the string conversion actually goes on the right. So we're getting the result first, and then dot to string is going to forcibly convert that to a string. There we go. Okay. Once that's done, always a good idea to close the data reader. We don't need it to be open anymore. And then we go ahead and close the SQL connection. So that's a good exercise, I think, in understanding how you run stored procedures that return multiple values. Maybe in another video we'll get into stored procedures or other SQL commands that return entire tables of results. There's a really cool way to work with that. But for today, we've now seen scalar and, in this case, reader results. So, after we get the results, we need to evaluate them, right? Determine whether new user created successfully. And we have to decide what we're going to do in each case. I think if it was created successfully, we'll display a message and then close the window. Otherwise, we'll simply display the message and then let them close that message and make changes and submit again. And since we're making a multi-line comment, maybe we'll do this. If successful, display message, then close window. If error, just display message. So what we can do there is, we know we're displaying a message either way, so before we really start an if block, we can just display that. So message box.show result. String result. I see. So, yep. So here's an interesting error. So it's saying that result doesn't exist. Kind of interesting because we obviously did declare result up here. Part of the reason for that is whenever you do something inside of a while block like that, it tends to have problems being pulled outside of the block later. So what we're actually going to do is say string result equals blank, right? And then just have it populate result with the value. So you'll have to do that a lot in C#, you'll find, especially if you're trying to grab this result outside of an event handler later on. You really have to declare the variables first. So let's go ahead and do that. Int new user ID equals -1, kind of a default value to go in there. Success equals 0. Right. So by declaring them first and then populating them, that makes it a little easier to call it earlier or later on down in the code. So we show the message box, and then we enter an if statement to decide whether we close the window or not based on the success. There we go. So if, and the if thing that's going to be true is success equal to 1. This dot close is a simple way to close the add user form, right? This being the form that we're in here. So if success equals 1, go ahead and close. All right, so that looks good. Let's take it for a quick dry run and see if it works. Nope, we're getting build errors. Oh boy. Don't worry about that. That's just something I did on accident earlier when I was clicking around. There we go. All right, so we go to the form, we log in here using my autofilled credentials, and that is taking me to add user, which, remember, I built some cool handling in here so I don't accidentally open multiple instances of the form. Let's go ahead and enter a test user. So Bill, retrieve, harlan.com. This should be a successful user insert. I also forgot to specify that this was a password input field, but we glossed over that. We'll go over that in another video. I think we did talk about it in the first video, actually. There we go. So the result was successfully added new user. Wonderful. And then it closes the form because the user was successfully added. In fact, I should be able to log in as this user now. Yep. So because I added the user properly using the stored procedure, I'm actually able to log in as him now. So let's try a user that isn't going to work, like Hank Hill 2, who we know that email address already exists. Right? So we get an error message back that says the email already exists, and because success is not going to equal 1, it should not close this form when I hit OK. Right. So that gives me a chance to maybe fix the email, right? Now if I specify HL2, there we go. Now it's a success. So that's it. That's the basics of creating a stored procedure that interacts with the database and making a form to submit inputs to the stored procedure for inserting data. This way people can insert rows into the user table without having to know anything about SQL whatsoever.